about to leave, already packing. Come with me, I'm not really asking. We'll get away to a place where we don't know. About to see the world in action, what we can be, life with no distractions. We'll get away, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out, die with my own doubts. Be free with me. Let's go, let's be free with me. Be free. Not looking back, eyes on the freeway, Bonnie and Clyde, a classic cliche. We're on the run, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out, die with my own doubts. Be free.
Good evening and welcome to our live stream tonight where we're doing a paper one warm-up. Now you'll notice our rogues gallery next to me. We've got Craig. Hi Craig, how are you doing?
Hi Duncan.
We've got Sarah. Hi Sarah,
Hiya.
how are you? And we've
Good,
got
thank
Katie.
you.
We've
I
got
am
Katie.
here, but I don't know. I can't be seen.
Katie is currently in darkness. We're not quite sure why. I will try my best to try and get Katie to reappear. But yeah, I'm not sure what's happened there. Anyway, it's lovely to see so many of you here. That's fantastic. We are answering your questions tonight on, rather than asking you questions, we're going to try and answer your questions on paper one. Loads and loads coming in, so I'm trying to keep an eye on what they are and select some of them to put up on the screen and get our panel to answer. I already see that a lot of you are answering each other in the chat window, which you're all brilliant at, so do keep an eye on what everyone's saying in the chat window, because you are very good at answering each other's questions. But let's without further ado, let's take a couple of questions. I'm going to start with a nice one before we start getting into all the globalization and stuff. Here we go. So we've got exam timings ? From Haley. Who could quickly go over that?
Okay, exam timings. Simply, you kind of get 80 marks on this paper, and you've got 2 hours, 120 minutes. So roughly, you're thinking about a minute and a half a mark. You can probably make up some time on your short answer questions, the 4 and 6 markers. Probably look to do those in 4 and 6 minutes. The 10 markers, about 15 minutes. Your 20 mark methods in context, about half an hour. And your 30-mark essay, I would probably look to spend about 45 minutes on that one. I don't know if anybody would disagree. It tends to be a general kind of one about exam timings.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with the timings basically. I just think that the key thing is making sure that you stick to those timings. I think that's the key. Like, as in, you're not going to get there's a ceiling. So, like for example, if you did 30 marker and you spent ages on that, there is a ceiling of how many marks you can get. I think sometimes people forget that actually the sort of the 4 and 6 markers are really essential that you do that. Though they're low marks, they can make the difference. They often sort of sometimes if people do it reverse, they do say the 4 and 6 mark last, but actually that can be a game changer.
I'd say don't try anything new in the exam that you haven't tried out before. So make sure that you're practicing with that stopwatch, and you're looking at the timings. And when you're practicing a 10 marker, you are stopping after 15 minutes. Don't forget to apply any extra time if you have extra time in the exam. And think about how much time you can assign to planning your answer before you start writing it. So if you know that 15 minutes for a 10 marker, if you know you can write a paragraph in 5 minutes, something I do a lot with my students is we do 5-minute paragraph practice, like several times a week. If you know that you can do those 2 paragraphs in 10 minutes, you've got 5 minutes to plan. But you've got to practice that strategy before you're in the exam. And then then you're in the routine and it's a habit.
Okay. There's lots of questions coming through that. How long would you take for a 30 marker?
I think we said about 40 minutes, didn't we, roughly?
Yeah, 40 to 45 minutes. Yeah. You're thinking about it being it's been a big part, as Katie's just sort of like said, you don't want to be spending hours and hours on that 30 marker because, if you write 7 or 8 paragraphs for a 30 marker, you probably would have done as much as you will have got after maybe about 5, for example. So you kind of are just doing extra kind of work for very little reward, and you're better off spending that time elsewhere.
And you've got the risk of waffling as well, which then makes the essay like not concise and focused. I've just seen the next one. Would you start the 4 and 6 marker or with 30 mark? I think it goes back to what Sarah was saying, which is don't try anything new at this stage, potentially. I'm obviously not your teacher, and I'm not you, so it's up to you. But I think whatever the formula you've worked on, I think this time it's honing those skills rather than being a bit of a maverick at this stage.
Yeah, I mean,
you can.
Yeah, it's possible because it's in a booklet. And sort of like, obviously you can answer them in any order because it's going to come to you in a booklet. Sometimes you might think, right, okay, well, let's start with the bigger questions and let's work your way through. It depends how you've been taught. If you've been taught to go through them, question by question, stick with that. If some people might want to do them last, the 4 and 6 markers. So if you've got 10 minutes left to go, and you've got one question left to do, you want it to be a 6 marker or a 4 marker. You don't want it to be the 30 marker. So you could do it that way. There's no hard and fast rules about which way you have to do it.
Okay, we've got what sets a 30 marker aside from a 20 marker? What else should we include? Obviously it's 10 more marks. How are they different?
Range. A greater range and a greater range of concepts and ideas that you will discuss. A 20 marker, obviously the 20 marker that you get on this paper is a methods in context question, but there'll be a wider range of explanations in a 30 marker than there will be in a 20, and so you should look to utilize that kind of full range of possible answers, and that'll be the main difference really. Still skills, still analysis, still evaluation. It's just the range really.
Okay. I'm gonna pick some of the points now. There's so many questions coming through, so I apologise. I will try and do a nice range of things, and certain things where there's quite a few people asking about the same thing. I'll try and make sure we definitely get to those. I won't get to every question, so I do apologise. Quite a lot of people have asked about sociology as a science, and we're getting occasionally in quite strong terms. They're begging for sociology as a science. So where could this come up in paper 1? It could come up in that 10 mark. In theory, it could come up in that 10 marker at the end, couldn't it? We've had a couple of questions saying, could that 10 marker be on theory as well as methods? It could be, yeah. So it could be either or a combination of the two. And I suppose sociology of science is a bit of a theory and methods question in a way. But remember, you will only be asked about two things because it's a 10 marker. So sociology as a science as a 20 marker might be something we talk about before paper 3. I don't want to get into the full the full sort of essay structure of a sociology as a science question, 20 marker question now. But does anyone want to just pick up sociology as a science as a potential 10 marker for paper?
I think the main thing is reading it correctly. I know it sounds a really silly point, but it's often, sometimes some students, obviously can be quite a stressful experience, is almost writing the other way around, that it's not and then it is. So I think just be mindful of reading that question, what that question is asking you to do. So that'd be an obvious one. I know that seems really like a really clear thing, but sometimes it's answers back to front as a question. I also think it's keeping it quite concrete, because obviously it's quite it's theoretical, as Duncan said, and a method-based question. So you sort of come into having those concrete examples in there. Obviously, I'm mindful not to go for a full essay plan, also conscious that you might not have the studies and the names that maybe I've taught my students. But I think definitely having a stock of names that think sociology is a science, sociology is not a science, and then there's a sort of in-between argument potentially that it's nearly a science. So, you know, the sort of idea that it's a young science, potentially. I don't know if anyone else wants to interject on that at all.
Just going to quickly say, oh my God, can I just say a massive hi to Miss Ty that she taught me A-Level Sociology?
Oh, I don't know. Hello. Small world.
It's nice to see that you've progressed to year 13 sociology as well.
Yes,
that's
finally.
Really good.
And I'm not married in that question as well, which is always not always good. But I'm still young.
So back to sociology science, I've picked a different one of the many questions that we've had about it.
We literally released the 20-mark walkthrough for sociology as a science yesterday. So you can see sort of like some of the different sides of the debate on that. As Katie's kind of rightly said, on this paper, it will be outline and explain 2 reasons why sociology cannot be a science, should not be a science, or it can be seen as being scientific. So you'll get one side of the debate, whereas in a 20 marker, it is an evaluate the view that sociology can be a science, and so you have to present 2 sides of it. So I think if it comes up, it's probably nicer to come up as a 10 marker than it is as a 20. However, as I said, we've just put up a 20 mark essay on that on the Tutor to You YouTube channel, where we discuss how you might do those different, how you might approach that type of question if it was a 20 marker.
Okay. We've had quite a few questions about globalization. I'm just going to pick one.
What a shot.
I'll put this one, but that doesn't mean that I'm necessarily going to go over it. Duncan, could you go over globalization? Obviously, as far as paper 1's concerned, we're talking about globalization and education, and where that's specifically mentioned in the spec relates to policy and education. And someone else asked, how does globalization fit into education? And that's it. And quite a few people are answering the questions in the chat window. So if you're interested in this, do go back, as people are giving lots of nice examples of globalization and education. But could anyone give a brief overview of the sort of discussion you could potentially have about globalization, whatever sort of question it might come up in? You could get a little 4 or a 6 marker on it. You could get a 10 marker. In theory, it could form part of an essay, couldn't it, about policy? Someone was suggesting, could it link with, could you have one on globalization and marketization? It's not impossible, but let's we're not in the business of predicting questions, by the way. We don't know, so
yeah. I mean, for me, I always think it's really important initially is to think about what the features of globalization are, irrespective of then when we look at it in education. Obviously, I know later on you don't probably want to be thinking about crime now and what other option topics are, but I think that's a good starting point. I think it's knowing what globalization is, what the features of that are, so that you're able to have some sort of frame of how that might have an impact on education, because then it gives it a structure. So thinking about potentially migration, thinking about how that might have an impact on education, how individualism and the rise in technology, how that might be, and then more sort of education related stuff, which is like obviously the PISA, which I've seen on the chat, and being aware of those types of things and how that also has an impact on policy. And I think, again, I've seen on the chat around sort of academisation and free schools. So I think it's, my starting point would be, well, if you've not really spent much time revising it, is really knowing what globalisation is, what the features of that are, and then how that might actually be particular things related to education, for argument's sake. But I'm also conscious this is, how many days we're Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So I don't want people now stressing because I'm like, oh, what's PISA? And people worrying. And it's I'm conscious of that as well. But basically, PISA is a global ranking system of schools, and our sort of marketisation policy might be filtering into that a little bit and sort of making sure that we're competing, and that's where sort of the league tables potentially might feed into that a little bit as well. So they're all interlinked. Oh, someone's put it. Dana's actually answered that already on there, so that's fantastic. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think the way globalization influences policy, a lot of people say there's not enough in the textbook. What I would suggest that you do for your revision is find 5 or 6 ways in which globalization has influenced educational policy. Katie's already mentioned there academization, which is obviously influenced by the American education system. We've mentioned free schools, which is Swedish education system. Another impact of globalization has been the way in which it's changed the way we teach. So, for example, you have in primary schools, they've adopted methods that come from China and South Korea in terms of maths, what's called mastery. Proposals to extend the school day is influenced by other countries, making comparisons through the PISA rankings. So we cherry pick ideas from elsewhere in the world. Rishi Sunak's proposal to have everybody doing English and maths to 18, that is influenced by the PISA rankings. And then you have other aspects which go into that idea of marketization and privatization as well. So you have the expansion of big tech companies. So you might have in your school, you might be an iPad school, you might be sponsored by Microsoft. One of the colleges I worked at was a Microsoft college, and all of the equipment was supplied by big TNCs, transnational corporations. You can also link that into the growth of multi-academy trusts, some of which will have their main basis overseas. So you're going into those kind of concepts. If you've got 5 or 6 ideas about how globalization influences our educational policy, and one of the aspects of globalization is the spread of transnational corporations, you can answer pretty much anything, whether it's a 4 or 6, a 10 or a 30 marker. So it's really useful in the next 3 or 4 days to have a look through some of the bits of material that we've posted for Tutor to You. We've got a globalization video, privatization video, marketization videos. Have a look at those and have 6 and know those 6. And if the worst comes to the worst, because I've got to say, every year since this specification has been, there is always a panic about globalization and educational policy. If the worst happens and you do get that question, you're going to feel confident in answering it if you've got 6 ways globalization has influenced that. How do we evaluate those? Well, you look at how effective that policy is. So, for example, if we think about some of the, you might sort of like assess that by looking at how effective have academies been? Have they been effective in improving educational achievement? How important have free schools been? And I think, Duncan, you know more about the Swedish free school system than I do, and how often it's been rejected in large part now, hasn't it, in Sweden? And it was
it's
very different cultural reasons for it. We can argue that with the PISA rankings, it's actually cranking up mental health pressure on pupils, that they need to get better results. We're asking, there's lots of criticisms of the proposals to study maths and English to 18, with people who are in the arts and humanities saying, well, actually, you're devaluing our subjects. There's lots of ideas that we're taking an idea from a culture that is not like ours, and we can criticize them that way as well. So in some ways, if you get those 6 down, you will be prepped for that globalization and
any
educational
possible.
policy question, any of them, 4, 6,
Yeah.
10. It has come up once, I think, as a 4-marker in about 2022, where it said, I think it was something like outline and explain 2 ways globalization has influenced policy.
Yeah.
And if you got that and you had 6 reasons and you put 2 in, you've nailed it. And
Yeah.
there's nothing to worry about.
Yeah, and you could get
There's
something similar for a tenner. A few people have asked if are there any sociologists we could bring into this. Sorry, Sarah, just to quickly interrupt. It's sometimes with the policy ones, it's harder to bring in the sociologists, isn't
Yeah.
it? But there are some that talk about the impact and the of policies. So that I'm sure we could get a sociologist or two into this.
I'm trying to think off the top of my head ones that would come into it. I mean, there's other impacts of globalization.
Yeah.
So we
Mac and
talk about
Gale,
impacts of impacts of globalization, and then impacts of globalization and policies to the growth of multiculturalism, and some of the policies that have actually looked to tackle global inequalities. Ball is usually a good one too. Ball's usually a good one. Colonization,
I was thinking you can also make links with like obviously like educational triage, obviously like that sort of response to those ranking, and also Chub and Mo, who sort of promote that sort of competition between students and would be in sort of obviously favour of that sort of new right approach to education, where we are competing globally, because that helps, you know, us in arguably within employment.
Okay, in a similar.
You've got Stuart Hall talked about handing over public services to private companies. So it is privatisation, but I guess it's part of globalisation as well. I just want to say, someone in the comments asked about, could you use deindustrialisation as an aspect of globalisation and linking it to the underachievement of boys? But also, was just going to say, Schumer, I think there's a really good point there. But in terms of policy, you could link deindustrialisation to the increase of school age to 18.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because of like the kind of needing a different type of workforce and your job. So I think that's something to bear in mind as well.
Yeah, and also thinking of the narrowing of the curriculum as well, as well, and how that's had an impact.
Yeah, absolutely. English and maths to 18, and all of those sorts of things you could link to that. The changes to the UK economy of various sorts. But yeah, that Mac and Gale type crisis of masculinity type link. If you were linking globalisation,
there's so much actually, like within that
other aspects of
question.
education. Absolutely. Sorry, Katie, go on.
No, just saying, like, I don't want to say, because everyone's like talking about globalisation, but I don't want to scare people, but I feel like it's one of those synoptic concepts. So I think it's worth revising, and I think if it's not going to come up at all, it will interweave into something, whether that's this unit or another topic. It's such a central theme. It's like socialisation in class in the cages as well. So it's there basically.
So, someone earlier put the question, why is AQA so obsessed with globalisation, which I'm not commenting on that, but globalisation certainly last year came up across a lot of questions, so you know, if you revise some stuff on globalisation, it's not going to do you any harm if it doesn't come up in this paper. Difference between marketisation and privatisation is something we've talked about quite a lot, actually, because it's come up as an issue from time to time, but it's definitely one to tease out, and quite a few people have asked about it, which is why I've picked up on that one.
I'll lead with this if you like. I think you've got to think of privatisation as in 2 halves. And one of those halves actually is marketisation. So don't be frightened if you haven't used these exact words to describe it. But I tend to talk about it as the exogenous and the endogenous privatisation. And the exogenous is the external stuff. So it's the polarization, it's the global transnational corporations that are feeding into the curriculum and selling their resources, you know, Apple schools and Google curriculum and things. Other brands are available. And then on the other side, so that's your exogenous, which is the private companies coming into education. On the other side of that, you've got your endogenous. That's the education system starting to privatize in the way that it acts like a marketplace. And that is marketisation. So if you have a question on privatisation, half of that is about marketisation. And if you have a question about marketisation, it is a question about endogenous privatisation. Anything to add?
I mean, that sounds great. Yeah, I mean, privatisation of education is almost like a feature of the marketisation, isn't it? It's one of the ways in which marketisation has had an impact on education. But marketisation is all about choice, and it's all about parentocracy. Privatisation in its sort of purest form, which I think would be I always mix up the endogenous and the exogenous. Sarah will correct me if I've got the wrong one, but this the exogenous is transferring public resources into the private sector. So things that are owned by the state, whether that be a school or an education authority or services to education, and a private company taking that on. And that could be on a relatively small scale, like the cleaning services or the
Canteen.
canteen or something like that, or it could be a whole school or chains of school in terms of academisation. So, and that's where you can say, well, it relates to marketisation, because obviously you can say academies is a marketisation policy, but it also happens to be privatisation because a private company has taken over the school, essentially. Yeah.
I mean, I was
also
saying
buying fantastic resources from external companies like Tutor2, and
Yeah,
if you
that's
think
another
back in the
example.
day, the local authority used to make a lot of resources and push them out to schools. So actually, that diversity and choice that we're quite critical of, I think, a lot of the time when we think about things like that, we kind of think, "Oh, that's really positive because it's it helps teachers and students."
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I'm
Anything
just
else on
thinking,
that?
going back, well, I was to say, thinking about something like Craig probably will say as well. I think going back to your revision, I think it's, again, under your belt, having 3 or 4 marketised, or maybe a bit more than that, marketisation policies and privatisation policies, and then maybe seeing the link between them. So when you're thinking of marketisation, you're sort of going back, first of all, to sort of 1988 into the Education Reform Act, and having some of those marketisation policies under your belt, like, Ofsted and league tables and meritocracy. And then the same, when you talked about privatisation, I think you sort of mentioned already the outsourcing and the private companies, and sort of even the examples themselves are a form of privatisation. So it's making an academisation we've mentioned already, and really be able to look at those and think to yourself, right, what are they? What are their features? What's the AO1 bit to that? How do they work? How do they have an impact? So sort of like the analysis a little bit, and then evaluating their impacts and their effectiveness on education. Have they hindered or helped education? And I can sort of visualise a little grid there, but that might help you to revise those, and so it's quite clear in your head. And Tutor2 have some really great videos that I think Craig made on those.
Absolutely.
So maybe you
Very
might
good
plot
ones.
them in the chat, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I'll try. Yeah. So there's loads of stuff on that, and it's worth having a look, because it is, it's great to tease out the difference, shows higher order thinking and a good bit of analysis and all that kind of thing. And then also, if you get a question specifically about privatisation, you don't want to talk about something that isn't privatisation. Also, sometimes students will talk about private schools, won't they? And although that is a private company, it's not really privatisation, because they were already private. If only privatisation is the process, if you like, or something. So if you get a question about privatisation, it's not asking you about private schools, it's asking you about more like things like academies and things like that. Okay. We've had quite a lot of questions about methods in context and the structure, and a few people talking about PET and all this kind of thing. So I feel we ought to spend a little bit of time on it.
Okay,
this is your baby. This is your baby, Craig.
PET. If you've been told by your teachers to use a PET format in your methods in context, I would say stick with that. Okay, but what I would be aware of if you're using a PET format, but that is practical, a paragraph and practical, paragraph and ethical, paragraph and theoretical, be aware that you might be better using a couple of practical points or a couple of theoretical points, that it's not fixed to one practical paragraph, one ethical paragraph, one theoretical paragraph. Different methods will have different strengths and limitations. Some of them will be more practical. Some of them will be more theoretical. Some of them will have lots of ethical issues. I think the 20-mark video that the 20-mark video that we did on this was on covert observations, and the covert observations obviously has lots of ethical issues. So you could have done a PEET for that one. What I would say is the main point that you need to think about with methods in context is in each of your paragraphs is make sure you're referring not only to the method you are using, what I call the how, but also to the characteristics of who you are studying, the who. This can be pupils, parents, teachers, and make reference to the topic itself. what is it about a certain topic that means it might be difficult or might be easier for researchers to use a specific method. So an example I often use is if you get something on, say, material deprivation, and they give you, say, a method where you have to talk about your economic situation at home, well, that's not going to be really useful because lots of people will not want to discuss their economic situation. So you might want to give them a method that's got a little bit more anonymity. So something like a questionnaire might be better used with material deprivation. Okay, so if you think about it, think whenever you make a point, and it's something we've done in the grade boosters, we talked about layering. Make your point, make your strength or limitation, and then try and link it to either the people that you're researching and or the topic you're researching. And if you do that consistently through your essay, you're going to be in the 17 to 20 level at the top. If you consistently do it. My top tip is never ever use the word participant in a methods in context essay. Always use the people that you may potentially study. So talk about teachers, talk about pupils, talk about working class pupils, talk about middle class pupils, talk about pupils from different pro or anti-school subcultures. How will those pupils react to interacting with a researcher? So as you can see, it's not one that fits into a neat structure. And I would say the item will give you more than enough to write a really good essay. So pick it apart.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've said this before. It depends what stance you want to take. Like, some people find it easier to think of themselves as a researcher and the problems they might face. I know we said this before. I personally think you're more likely to feel like a stakeholder, like a student. So you probably can imagine what it feels like to be a student that would be presented with that piece of information. You may have an inkling of what it's like as a teacher because you've seen the teachers and how they react with certain bits, particularly observations, but really sort of use your Verstehen, like try and get that empathy and put yourself into those shoes of those people. How would you feel if you were presented with like an interview around experience of racism within the school and you're the minority group within the school? So really put yourself in that headspace, and I think that's really helpful as well, to think about those experiences.
I think you can also think of yourself as like a consultant if you want to. So as if you've been consulted on what's the best method to use for this particular project. And actually, you can have quite an authoritative voice over that, particularly when you come to the conclusion and you can say, well, actually, yeah, I do think this is an effective method, but you're going to have to be really careful of this potential issue, or this is the most significant strength. And this is why this is a really good method, and really kind of comment on whether it is suitable or not. And you can kind of advise what you think needs to be overcome or what you think might be a limitation.
Yeah. Okay. So it's really good.
I like that, Sarah. I like that.
Yeah. It really reiterating, like, the key thing is the context. In context, that is the absolutely, that is what you're being asked about. Using that method to study that topic, and so do them together. I mean, that's the key thing. A lot of students will talk about the method and we'll talk about the topic and we'll talk about the people who are being researched, but kind of do it separately. Try and bring them all together in one point when you're making a point. So this is what Craig was talking about with the layering. Bring all three of those things, the who, the how, the what, together in that one point, so that as often as you can, and that's another reason why sometimes you might decide to do 2 practical points or 2 ethical points, because it might be that you can contextualize those better. Sometimes you might have a point that you can make a general criticism of the method, but actually you're struggling to think how you could do the contextualizing, and you don't want to miss out on making a point that you could have made by making a second practical point, for example. So, not saying don't think PET is a good way of remembering the sorts of things you could be talking about. I saw people talking about, I'm not going to pervert or whatever in there as well. These, I don't particularly like that one, but there's lots of different. I used to do QQRVR pet, which no one can remember, but there's various like mnemonics for remembering the sorts of strengths and limitations you can talk about. But the key thing actually is the contextualize. So it's not just what's this, let's say a limitation of over observation is the Hawthorne effect. Yeah, that's a general limitation. okay, we're observing teachers, so can you think of a particular reason why teachers might change how they behave when they've been observed? I'm sure you can. And then what's the topic? We haven't said one, but start thinking, well, why might they particularly change their behaviour because that's the topic that's being studied? How might you overcome that? Sarah was saying, a little bit in the conclusion, you might say you might overcome this by making it covert, but maybe not. but that kind of thing, nice and focused. Okay.
I was going to say, to keep the focus, because obviously you're at risk of just regenerating the item if you just stick purely to the pets. The item, it will give you those often the practical, ethical, theoretical problems within that. So actually what you do is you can lift them out once you've sort of used the item. That goes back to what Sarah said at the beginning about planning, and then looking at them and thinking, well, how can I put those into context? How can I layer that? So it might indicate, I was looking at one the other day about official statistics and secondary data, or was it just secondary data, but linked to official statistics and the selectiveness of them for research, looking at students' achievement. So that would be your sort of theoretical problem as such, the selective nature of them, and then you can build and layer from that. And that takes some of the sort of guesswork out of it, potentially, if you're using the item.
Okay. I hope that's okay with methods in context. I'll keep an eye if anyone's got asked any further subsequent questions on methods in context, and we can always come back to it.
Again, there's a methods in context walkthrough on that playlist that Duncan posted really early on as well.
Yeah, so pop onto this the Tutor to You Sociology. Well, sorry, the Tutor to You YouTube channel. Go to find the sociology playlist. There's one on question walkthroughs is the playlist, and yeah, there's a nice methods in context one in there that'll give you some guidance on a structure and all that kind of thing, and a technique, some exam gold. Okay, how do you structure a 10-mark question on methods if it comes up? Obviously, all your 10 markers look very similar, don't they? It's 2 paragraphs. One way is, another way is, or one criticism is, another criticism is. But I do see why the 10 marker on methods, people think, I'm not quite sure how to do that, because like with our apply and analyze ones on paper 1, we know we're using the hooks and we're going to use those and develop those in our paragraphs. With our paper 2 ones, which I'm not going to say too much about tonight, but we know we're going to be applying one bit of the spec to another. And these 10 mark ones, on the one hand, it feels on paper 1 and 3, your theory and methods one, on the one hand, it feels a bit more straightforward. You're just being asked 2 criticisms of something, 2 ways of something, 2 strengths of something. But then what is the meat? Where's the beef?
Evidence. It depends on what the question is, to be honest with you. I mean, if it's like last year, for example, there was one on explain 2 limitations of using qualitative methods, and another one was outlining 2 limitations of using quantitative methods. But where you would get into the higher grade boundaries is not only stating what is a limitation, explaining why it's a limitation, but then maybe using an example from your sociological knowledge of a piece of research that has had that problem. So, when you've done your research methods module, you might have done observations. You will have looked at a range of different observations and talked about some of those issues. And you can apply that knowledge. And with this paper and paper 3, if you're getting asked a question on methods, that piece of research that you use to back up your point can be from anywhere across the specification. It doesn't have to be education research. It can be from anywhere on that 10 marker. Okay. Likewise, if you got a 10 marker on theory and it asked you for 2 criticisms of functionalism, which has come up before, you can use 2 criticisms from anywhere across the specification of functionalism. It's not limited. So that's with the structure of a 10 marker on methods, you're looking at making your point, explaining how that is a limitation, and then maybe giving an example of how that of that limitation there. And then with these 10 markers, stop. You don't have to evaluate on that specific question.
Okay, thanks very much, guys. We've got so many questions. I want to kind of move through some quite quickly. I mean, there's a lot to there's a lot to cover in this one question, and but Deborah has asked a few times, so I don't want to not keep coming back to it. Please, social action, I'm begging. I think an early version of the question, I'm not sure, it might have been from Deborah, might have been someone else, was, could social action theory come up, and I think you mean in the theory and methods as opposed to like sort of in interactionist approaches to education. Although that's an interesting question as well. But yes, anything from theory and methods can come up in the 10 marker. But so, what could we maybe say about social action as far as paper one's concerned? Obviously, a lot of the theory stuff we tend to think about the 20 marker on paper 3, and where you might have to get into a bit more detail and a bit more breadth on these things. But what could we say about social action for paper 1?
Gosh, there's so much you can say about social action. As you were saying it, I was like, oh my goodness, there's so much.
I know, it's such a broad question.
It's such a broad question. I mean, I suppose it's the extent of which, I know it's just an outline and explain, but like just thinking about the ways in which social action either exists or doesn't. It depends how it's phrased really, doesn't it, in that question. I mean, it depends if they might just talk about social action theory generally, or they might talk about sort of structure instead, but it depends what they're asking, how they're phrasing it. So, and it also depends if they particularly pick a theory, like you said, in interactionism. It could be even, I was just thinking, they might even look at it about linking it to methodology and what methodology they might. There's quite a lot of scope. I'd love to hear your views on this. I feel like my head's going like that because I'm thinking, well, actually, they could do a straightforward theory question, but they could also equally pick a theory that you're supposed to know is a social action, like works in the idea of action. Or they could link it to methodology.
I think it's, I mean, when you're talking about methodology, it could be something as straightforward as outline and explain two factors that influence a sociologist's choice of topic and method. And the fact that they follow a social action idea would mean that they're more likely to choose interpretivist methods that produce qualitative data. So it could be asked that way. You could get one, outline and explain 2 reasons why social action theories are more useful than structural theories in contemporary society. And then you would have to maybe apply some of your knowledge from around the specification and say, well, social action theories are better or more suitable for use because, just trying to think of a couple of reasons off the top of my head. So because they look at more in depth and there's greater diversity in contemporary society. So we need to get a greater understanding of how people react, because human beings don't react in a formulaic way anymore. There's number of different ways in which that social action question can be asked. I think you kind of got to, when you're revising social action theories, you've got to think about what are some of the key features of the social action theories that you've discovered from across the specification. So this might be something that you're not 100% aware of. It tends to be, social action theories tend to be a little bit more hidden than others, but there are features of interactionism, there are features of labeling theory, even elements of postmodernism I've seen be awarded under social action theory as well. So you're looking at things that are more individualistic and where people have shown agency and shown free will, and you could apply those to social action theories. Unlike, say, for example, functionalism and Marxism, where we tend to have big thinkers, 2 or 3 big thinkers in like Durkheim, Parsons, Merton, and then Marx, Althusser, Gramsci. In social action theory, you're looking at the likes of Becker, Weber, trying to think, Goffman,
Cohen.
By Cohen, I mean Stan Cohen. Yeah.
Stan Cohen. And then within social action, you could also get elements of sort of like what like the likes of Giddens talk about. So the concept of structuration. So it's quite a broad area. And I think if you look back at the questions from 2 years ago, I think it was social action. I think it was evaluating the usefulness of social action theories to our understanding of wider society. Look at that question. I think this one is free for everybody to access on the AQA website. Look at the mark scheme, and you will see sort of like how broad that social action question could potentially be.
A really important one is if you got a question like that, and this is true of any of these sorts of questions, really, not just of social action, and say you got 2 reasons why social action theories are better than structural ones, for example. Don't spend some of your answer telling us why they're not, or why structural ones are better. If it's later when you talk about essays and stuff, it's great to hear the debates and the arguments and things. But if you're asked for 2 reasons why or 2 ways in which, give them that and explain it and illustrate it. Don't, you won't be rewarded for like doing the other side of the argument in that 10 marker. Yeah, outline and explain 10 marker on paper 1. Okay. Yeah.
I think if you're revising social action and you're kind of thinking holistically because of paper 3 as well, but if you've got 4, like Craig said, 4 topic aspects, so it might be labelling theory and you've got a go-to example for that, maybe from crime. You've got maybe something about Weber's forms of action, maybe, or social change. If you do beliefs, you might have Calvinism as your backup example. You might then have something about subcultures and interactions, and that might be linked to education. So if you've got 4 solid examples, and then you've got your strengths and weaknesses of it as a theory, so in terms of usefulness, and then you've got a couple of ideas of the types of research methods that social action theorists would prefer, you're covered for any type of question that could come up. So just one nice revision sheet and you're good to go.
While we're on these sorts of 10 markers, value freedom versus value laden, I'm begging.
A lot of that will cross over what we've just been talking with. So it's sort of like you value your concepts of sociology being value laden. So the likes of your interactionists and your interpretivists are going to say, well, sociology is value laden. People's values are going to influence that. Your positivist view is going to sort of like say, well, no, sociology can be value free. We can look at it scientifically. We can analyze it in a very scientific way. And then you've got somebody like Weber who suggests that, yes, we can do research objectively and value free. However, sociologists cannot be value free. As human beings, we all have our own values, and we always tend to sort of like, we tend to side. Becker talks about siding with the underdog. Gouldner talks about the influence outside agencies have on a sociologist's values. So essentially that is a debate. Value freedom versus value laden is, can sociology be objective or not? And that's what you're really looking at. And how much does a sociologist's values influence their research? How that could be approached in a 10 marker. You could get outline and explain 2 ways sociologists' values influences their research. Outline 2 explanations for why sociology can be seen to be value free. There's different ways. Again, with that debate, think about getting 2 points on the value free side, 2 points on the value laden side, and 1 point, such as Weber, in the middle that mixes that up. And that is enough, I think, to answer some of the 10 and even a 20 marker.
Yeah. I think back to 30 markers now. Maddie's asked a lot of times about evaluation. She's had a couple of questions about evaluation. One about how do you evaluate properly, and then a further one about whether whether explicit evaluation should be in the same paragraph as the point that you're evaluating. If we start with how to evaluate properly, and I guess this is about explicit evaluation rather than juxtaposed evaluation, and it's about developed evaluation rather than kind of bolt-on evaluation. These are our key things. Who wants to?
I mean, I feel like with evaluation, I feel like sometimes we might be tempted to do like I don't know, just we get given all these things like pill, and I think we'll be careful about sort of quantifying how many paragraphs and that might be linked into evaluation. So to evaluate properly is about doing explicit evaluation, so it's evaluating the point that you've made, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's always a criticism. I think we've done a lot of work on this through TutorStudent. I'm sure teachers have as well, about sort of scale evaluation. So it can be a strength, it can be a criticism, it can be an alternative view, a limitation, it can be a bit of evidence. But we can also see what I sometimes call sandwich evaluation, which is where you make a point, you do some explicit evaluation, you might evaluate that evaluation, and so that might mean that you're not writing 5 paragraphs, you're writing 4. So it's not like it's not formulaic. I often say to my students that to get into sort of those top bands, that you're controlling the essay. Like, it's not that you're reading the essay that's in front of you and you're evaluating that, not something you've pre-planned and then just going to regurgitate it on a plate, because that might not actually end up being explicit evaluation, because you're just evaluating a point that you've remembered and revised, but it's not really, it's on a sort of tangent to the question that's been asked in front of you. So I think it's just really reading the question and making sure the point that you're evaluating is actually about the point that's being made, but that point that's being made has to also be the point related to the question, if that makes sense. And it sometimes goes back to what Sarah said. It's taking that time at the beginning of the essay to plan, and I think that will make you evaluate more properly, because you've taken that time and like, what is this question actually asking me to do? Yeah.
Okay,
I think as well, sometimes it's that sense of weighing up throughout the essay. You might say something like, whilst I acknowledge that functionalists criticise this idea, we can bear in mind that this is useful because, or, you know, whilst there's some conflict here, this, you know, it has a contribution. So kind of showing, sometimes just acknowledging that there are two sides to every argument and that there are grey areas. And kind of being sort of explicit about that, then you're showing that sense of evaluation. It doesn't always look like however a criticism of this is.
As a really sort of general thing, just to think about in your exam, because obviously we're getting very close to it now, so it's like you're going to go in and do your essays more or less as you've been practicing them. You know, that's what you should be doing. But one thing I would say is, when you're writing a paragraph, always think to yourself, am I answering the question at the moment? And if you're not, bring it back. You know, what you're talking about probably is relevant, but make it clear why it's relevant. So if you're answering a question about Marxism and you've started a paragraph about functionalism, you know, make sure that by the time you've got to the end of that paragraph, it's very clear why this point about functionalism that you're writing is relevant to the question about Marxism. And that way you're actually making your evaluation explicit even in a different paragraph. So ordinarily, in answer to that question about should your explicit evaluation be in the same paragraph, ordinarily, yeah, that would be like, kind of, you make a point, analyze that point, evaluate it explicitly. But sometimes you might have a new paragraph that actually is kind of an evaluative paragraph, but it should be explicitly evaluating the question. Yeah. Okay. So yeah.
Particularly those theory questions, because obviously it's sometimes evaluate the usefulness ones. You know, the theory, whether it be around education, or it be a theory question in the 20 marker, which is later on. It can end up being a whistle-stop tour of theories, and that's not answering the question, is it?
No, are you still answering the question? Ideally, you wouldn't have like a, here's my Marxism paragraph, here's my functionalism paragraph, here's my feminism paragraph, because it would be much more evaluative if you put them together and have those arguments and debates. If you find yourself falling into that pattern, though, just think, I need to bring it back to the question.
I've seen someone writing here, don't sit on the fence. You know, that's where your conclusion, as part of your evaluation, you can sort of, like, I think Sarah said that already, is come down on like one side. Do you know what I mean? Like, you know, whatever that theory is that you've evaluated, is it a useful theory, it's not a useful theory, or does it have a positive effect or a negative effect, or whatever it is you're exploring. You know, you can use that explicit evidence there, or bring something potentially new in. But
But sometimes there is a kind of midpoint argument that you can take if you're, you know, so if you're being asked, you know, evaluate the view that internal factors are more important than external factors in education or something, you can say that the two, you know, you can't really separate them, the two work together or whatever. It's not one or the other. If it's, do we live in a postmodern society? Or, you won't do that one in paper one.
No.
but, so I won't do that one. But you know, there are questions where there's a good sociological fence-sitting argument, in which case that's fine to do that.
I think if you kind of say it depends on, I love that phrase in that final conclusion. So yeah, okay, external factors are the most influential, I've made my decision, but actually it depends on other factors being in place. It depends whether we view something like language codes as a bit of both, actually. So just showing that you understand that you've made a decision, yet you recognise that there have to be things in place.
Right. Now, I do appreciate that people have asked lots and lots of questions that we haven't got to, and I really wanted to try and get to as many as possible, but I hope, you know, a lot of them were on similar things. I hope we have covered an awful lot of them. Those of you who are still asking, I bet you can find some answers to your questions in Craig's videos on the GTU YouTube channel, across the GTU website. If you go onto the website and search under sociology some of these questions, we will have answered a lot of them. I apologise if we haven't got to yours. Just quickly, there was one about how often do you need to use the item for the 30 marker. There's no rule on it in the way that, like for the 10 marker, you've got to use it for each of your points. There isn't a rule, but I'd try and make a few references to the item if you can, because the item's there, it's useful, it's giving you some interesting pointers, but there's no strict rule. There's no cap on the marks or anything like that.
I think the key thing with the item is knowing that you have to go beyond it on the 30 marker.
Yeah.
That whatever's mentioned in the item, you need to go beyond that, and the 20 markers, too.
Yeah. That is not your essay plan. It's giving you some useful ideas, but and sometimes it's giving you ideas for how you're going to evaluate and stuff as well, rather than necessarily your main points in the essay. But we've got from Lilia last minute revision tips, and this seems like a good way to finish, really. So can each of you give some last minute revision tips, and then we'll call it a night?
Come up with 5 reasons for everything. Quite simply, it will cover most of the bases that you've got. So if you're thinking about your education, think about 5 reasons for social class differences, 5 reasons for gender differences, 5 reasons for ethnic differences, 5 things that form identity, 5 educational policies for different topics. So 5 marketization policies, 5 policies that tackle inequality, 5 policies that are influenced by globalization. Come up with all of the kind of different subheadings and come up with 5 reasons for those, and make sure you've got them in, and you've got all of these kind of concepts. Likewise, I would say with your research methods, know 2 practical, ethical, and theoretical strengths and limitations of each of those methods, and that will cover a lot of the bases that you've got. I'll let other people talk about other stuff.
I would say do exactly what Craig just said. And then when you've done that for all of your topics, go back and think concepts. So don't think who said what. Don't worry about the names of who said what, but do a vocabulary list for every topic, so that when you are writing about those explanations, you are writing about them using the terminology that gets you marks. So you are being sociological, not those taxi driver answers. And have those as vocab lists, and then practice paragraphs and use that vocab and highlight that vocab afterwards and practice using it, because it's like another language, isn't it, sociology?
I like that concept of the taxi driver answer, because I know exactly what you mean, where somebody will give you just a very common sense, kind of just their opinion, instead of one that's rooted in sociological ideas. Yes.
Concepts over thinking.
Yeah, because I think someone asked that earlier about that. I'm really boring, actually. I'm going to say, do you know what? Essay plans, like, I think going back to those 5 and then incorporating that in the concepts, but get familiar with the structure of a paper and what that looks like. I think that might be really helpful. At the end of the day, there's a lot of information out there, and I think that's great, and I think that's part of the pick and mix society that we live in, and it's brilliant. But I think go on to the AQA website, familiarise yourself with the structure of the exam, and look at the mark schemes associated to that. And that's personally, right now, at the end of the day, that's how you're going to be assessed. And we can't hide behind that. And we can do like fun things like chat to your friends and do group revision, and that's all great. But at the end of the day, you are having an exam. And I know that's a bit stressful to think about, and it will be by AQA, and it will have that structure. And they've got the right wording and all that sort of thing. So I think stick to that at sort of like your last minute revision. Familiarise yourself with the paper.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, guys. I really hope we've said some stuff that you found really useful tonight. You got a little bit of time still. When's the exam?
Monday.
Yeah, so you got a couple more days in the weekend. So don't panic, but you've got time to anything we've talked about where you think, I need a little bit more on that. There's time to find stuff on that. Okay.
Just to mention, there are a lot of people are asking if we are doing other streams before the other exams. Yes, we are doing ones before paper 2 and paper 3, but also before paper 2, we're doing them on different optional topics, and we have recorded and released some kind of pre-recorded live streams for some of the topics that are less popular
less
families.
often done. And, they're already out there, so you can get on those. So we have got quite a few. So we'll be doing some question and answer ones like this just before paper 2 and paper 3, but we're also doing more of the kind of activity type live streams between the exams as well. But very good luck. Very good luck
Good luck.
with your paper 1 exam. Thanks very much, guys, and thanks everyone for our wonderful panel for all your contributions today. Cheers, guys. See you soon. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Take care.
Bye.
Good luck. Take care. Bye.
Good luck.